What we've got are a number of businesses that have instituted mandatory vaccines, and they will talk to their experiences. And the idea is to then get a bit more clarity on the whole issue about mandatory vaccinations, given that all indications are that government will not pronounce on this in any way. And businesses are probably going to do this on their own. So Tim, you want to get to the slide that just sets us in? Okay, there we go. So the current status of the vaccination program, the problem is that we've got declining demand. We've sorted out the supply side, but the demand side is now presenting a problem. And as you can see there in the graph, but I'll just go through the narrative. Only 9.7 million people have been fully vaccinated. Of that, 24% are 18 and over. 13.3 million individuals have received their first doses. Target is 28 million first doses by the 16th of December. All groups are plateauing well before the target. So it's not just any particular group, but all groups are plateauing. And what we need to do is get spikes in the weekly doses as the next age group opens and what happens, and then it quickly falls off. To achieve 70% coverage, that's 28 million first doses by 16th of December. An average of 2 million doses must be administered per week. This equates to 350,000 doses per day, whereas what we are currently doing in the last 4 weeks anyway, we've been doing 200,000 per day in the last 4 weeks. Longer term demand depends on success of demand generation strategies, which we're trying a whole lot of strategies.
I just asked Saki to please reach out to you.
Sorry, folks, can you mute? We're trying a lot of strategies, including the presence of UMA weekend, which wasn't as successful as one hoped. So this is the problem. And we believe that mandatory vaccinations is a critical element of generating demand, and hence this webinar. So this sets the scene, what the problem is currently. I'm going to hand over to Helton Cheadle, but before I do that, just let me also say that we are, as BUSA, working with Helton to explore the possibility of a declarator that could then bring about legal certainty and legal clarity on this, so that if businesses do get some clarity and do have some certainty that if they do decide to go the mandatory vaccination route for their staff, there is some legal basis for that, and we're working on that at the moment. Thank you. Helton, can I hand over to you to take us through the sort of legal and constitutional aspects of this? Thank you.
Okay, there I am. If you see Charles Newton on the screen, it's because I've had to make use of his laptop in order to join the meeting. I wasn't able to do so on my own. Timothy, you were going to put up slides? Okay. The outline for this discussion is really what you see in front of you. Briefly look at constitutional rights and their limitation. Look at three pieces of legislation: the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Mines Health and Safety Act, and the Occupational Health and Safety Direction, which was promulgated under the Disaster Management Act. Then finally, then the consequences for those employees who refuse to be vaccinated. And then there's always, what all lawyers do, two caveats. If we can just now move to the next slide, Timothy. So the outline of my argument is really very simple. First of all, no right is absolute. because under Section 36 of our Constitution, a law of general application may limit a right, provided that its purpose is sufficiently important and its effect is proportionate. The only constitutional right that is directly infringed is the right to bodily integrity in Section 12 of the Constitution. Timothy? So although people speak about the right to religion or right to belief as being infringed, the right itself is really a right to free exercise of religion and belief. And a vaccination mandate that applies generally across the board does not infringe the free exercise of religion. So in any constitutional argument, the first thing you have to demonstrate is that the right has been infringed. Insofar as bodily integrity is concerned, it's very clear that a mandatory vaccination means a health intervention without consent. When it comes to religion, the question is, well, does this interfere with the right to religion? And if one looks at the US Supreme Court decisions in this regard, the US Supreme Court and its most conservative members have always held for a very long period that a neutral law that's applicable to all religions but restricts a tenet of that religion is not it doesn't infringe the right to religion. And the best example is the case involving Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that children should proselytize, and part of the proselytization is the handing out of trading or selling their newsletters, and one of the US Supreme Court cases in this regard, dealing with the prohibition of child labor, Jehovah's Witnesses argued that the law singled them out and accordingly challenged their right to religion. But the US Supreme Court said, no, what you have here is a neutral law that applies to all religions. It doesn't affect the free exercise of religious beliefs and of religion. Now, the other right that's often referred to is the right not to be discriminated against. But discrimination, the constitutional right, is in respect of unfair discrimination. And the arguments that I'm going to raise in support of the limitation of the right to bodily integrity in a moment apply equally to discrimination. It's not unfair. It's rational. It doesn't attack people because of their religious beliefs, and it doesn't fall within any of the grounds in the Constitution. And even though the grounds are not limited, in other words, new grounds can be established. The obligation to discrimination against the unvaccinated, it will, for the very reasons I'm going to set out in a moment, not be unfair. Next slide, please. Now, the first act is the occupational health and safety, and it covers all workplaces other than mines and merchant ships. It is a law of general application. It applies generally to all employers within that scope. And if one looks at Section 8, the general duties of employers, you'll see that every employer shall provide and maintain, as far as is reasonably practicable, a working environment that is safe and without risk to the health of its employees. And subsection 2 states, without derogating from the generality of those duties, all right, an employer must provide and maintain systems of work without risks to health, take such steps as may be reasonably practicable to eliminate or mitigate any hazard, and enforcing such measures as they may be necessary in the interest of health and safety. Now, what's also important about this Act is that it also imposes duties on employers in respect of employees who come into contact with their employees. So in other words, if we're talking about a retailer, customers come into contact with the cashiers and the people who assist in the shop. And the same will apply to contractors that come into the workplace and people who visit the workplace. So the obligation is not only to protect one's employees, but also to protect people who engage in the who are not employees, who engage with the employer. Now, who come onto the work site or engage with employees. Now, what's important about that obligation is that if for example, it's able to be proved that the person visiting the worksite has contracted COVID-19 because of engagement with an employee who is not vaccinated. The workers' compensation regime doesn't apply to them, and the employer is then liable and may be liable in derelict. Now, it is very difficult to prove the source of COVID-19, but there can be situations where it could be probable. And the final thing about the Occupational Health and Safety Act is that it's a criminal offence for employees not to obey the health and safety rules of the employer. If we could quickly move to the next slide, which is the Mine Health and Safety Act. Now, this act is also a law of general application. It applies to all mines. And here you can see, again, that an employer is obliged, as far as reasonably practicable, to provide and maintain a working environment that is healthy and safe. So again, you'll see this language of reasonably practicable in both the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Mine Health and Safety Act. Now, if one goes to the next slide, the question then is vaccination a reasonable practicable measure? Well, it's preeminently a reasonable practicable measure. The science is clear that COVID-19 vaccines are effective and reduce this risk of serious illness and fatalities and transmission. The purpose of both acts is to protect the health and safety of workers and people who come onto the workplace. And it's proportional, given that the vaccination is not a particularly invasive health intervention, and that there aren't less invasive means as effective as vaccines. So masks and social distancing are important, but they're not as effective as vaccination. Could move to the next slide. Now, the direction is published under the Disaster Management Act, and it endorses the employer's right to impose mandatory vaccination. And the guidelines, and it says it leaves it to the employer to decide whether to make it mandatory. And it refers, when it does so, it refers to the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And the guidelines require a process, extensive information, and the guidelines set, the direction gives various links to the National Department of Health documentation. It requires extensive consultation, and it entails an endeavor to accommodate the employee who refuses to be vaccinated. In other words, what one is in fact doing is treating a person who is not vaccinated similar to a person who's disabled. And so the idea of reasonable accommodation in disability law is to see whether or not one can take steps and measures that will allow the person to work. So the typical example is someone who has an accident, a road accident, and can only is only mobile in a wheelchair. And the question then is: is it a reasonable accommodation for the employer to have instead of steps a wheelchair access to the workplace? And if it's on the first floor, well, then it probably is a reasonable accommodation. If there's no lift and it's the 10th floor, then that's not reasonable. And in the context, I think, of COVID-19, what would be reasonable, obviously, is that some people can work entirely from home. And there are other considerations one needs to take into account, which is that most employment is team-based, and just working from home severely reduces ability to have the kind of morale, the kind of culture that one seeks to achieve by employees coming to the workplace. But nevertheless, we will seek to accommodate them. As a lawyer, I've found that I'm really been very easy to, in fact, work entirely from home. But of course, I'm part of a law firm, and a law firm has other obligations like assisting candidate attorneys and the like. And it's very difficult to perform those functions if only from home. But nevertheless, what the employer is obliged to do is just try and accommodate that employee. And as you see in that last bullet point, the direction is silent as to dismissal, and accordingly, the Labour Relations Act applies. And the silence was that in the NEDLAC discussions, the unions were very unhappy about including a dismissal provision. You can go to the next slide. So the general contractual rule is that if employees tender their services and the employer does not accept the tender, the employer is required to pay the employees. Okay, the exception to the rule is that the tender must be in accordance with the employer's rules as to dress. If you're an airline pilot, you have to dress in a certain way. You can't arrive in jeans. Sobriety, and under the pandemic, a mask, and if it becomes mandatory vaccination, a vaccination certificate. So an employer can accordingly refuse to allow an unvaccinated employee to enter the workplace without attracting any liability for pay by simply by operation of this general contractual rule. And so obviously at the beginning, one would not admit the employee, and one would pursue a process of consultation in order to try and persuade the employee to be vaccinated in order for the employee to return to work. Then if we come to the next slide. So the LRA, as you all know, permits employers to dismiss employees for valid reasons and after a fair procedure. And those are really related to conduct, capacity, and operational requirements. And in a strange way, if it's, finally having tried to reasonably accommodate the employee, having engaged in consultation, and tried to persuade the employee to be vaccinated, the employer can it will be valid to dismiss on all three grounds. So one looks at the refusal to obey a health and safety rule, which endangers others, constitutes serious misconduct. Note that in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the employee's failure to obey the rule is a criminal offence. So that gives a very clear indication of how serious a form of misconduct that would be. As I've already indicated, it's also a species of incapacity, not being able to meet the requirements of the job. If you're a driver and you lose your driver's license, well, you're no longer capable of doing the job that you were employed for. It's also a species of incompatibility, that in the sense that it's incompatible with the requirements of the firm, the culture of the firm, and it can also be justified as an operational requirement. Now, I now come to the last slide, which are the caveats. And the caveat is firstly that mandatory vaccination, as we all know, is highly charged, subject as a result of misinformation. And whatever the law permits or requires an employer to do, the answer is not only in the law, but more so in human resource management. I mean, this is a very serious human resource management issue, and the law sets the framework. But ultimately, what's got to happen is it's for the human resources to seek to persuade the employees with minimum amount of disruption, minimum amount of tough decisions to get both the workplace going and the employees vaccinated. And finally, this presentation is an overview of the law, and any policy or measure that you want to put in place should be settled by your own legal advisors. So in other words, I really think it's important that, different workplaces are so very different. The difference between a retail outlet and a mine and the factory seem to me required very different ways of looking at it, and particularly concepts of reasonable accommodation in order to comply with the Occupational Health and Safety Direction. That's me.
Thank you very much, Halton. Ron, if we could hand over to you.
Just coming up there, Tim. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to Hilton for that overview on the legal framework. I think you're very, very helpful. Wanted to take the opportunity this afternoon to share with you, some thoughts on Discovery's experience in moving towards our intention to implement mandatory vaccination as of the 1st of January. This is very much a Discovery experience to try and keep this presentation quite practical. So don't take this as certainly your legal counsel or guidance. You got to lean on your own legal counsel and guidance and your Hilton's advice on that front. I think I wanted to start out the presentation just by saying mandatory vaccination is becoming more commonplace globally. So many countries are implementing many forms of mandatory vaccination. In fact, you're seeing quite conservative countries like Australia, the UK, and Canada come into the mix around mandatory vaccination across care workers and healthcare and healthcare workers. France has obviously got a much broader policy in place in terms of your public places, transport, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, I think we're seeing many companies globally, and particularly in the US, move to mandatory vaccination policies. So the big tech players, the bank players, the retailers in the US have already implemented these policies at scale. New York's public health system obviously implemented quite a big policy over the course of the last few days. And then, of course, in South Africa, we're seeing increasing number of companies starting to implement mandatory vaccination. Our colleagues from Sanlam, obviously on the call today, but then Rhino Africa, UNB, Curro, and then our friends and colleagues in the healthcare sector at Mediclinic and Life. From a Discovery perspective, I guess you're stepping back and looking at the process we went to in implementing mandatory vaccination. We've sort of distilled it down into 5 main elements around things to consider. I think the first and most important element is what we've labeled the why. This is really the backbone of the mandatory vaccination policy and storyline, and is really important in creating alignment and conviction across the various levels in the organization, right through from the board, through the various exco structures, and then indeed through the middle management and leadership structures across the organization, because that's really where the backbone of implementation sits. Number two is the legal considerations. I think Hilton has covered all of those legal considerations, and there are many acts at play here. I'll try and distill those down into 4 or 5 main points during the presentation. Number three is there are significant moral and ethical considerations to consider, and there's really an exploration of your organizational culture, values, and purpose. And we spend quite a lot of time on this third quadrant in particular. As you know, Discovery's core purpose is to make people healthier and to enhance and protect their lives. And we think there's nothing more important than vaccination right now in helping us achieve our core purpose. Fourthly is the operational benefits and risks, and there are, of course, the operational benefits and risks here, particularly in the HR space, but equally there are operational risks around not implementing a policy of this sort. So when one considers a space where you don't have mandatory vaccination in place, and one day someone comes to work, as Hilton mentions, and contracts COVID at work, and just says, look, I think that's because your people weren't vaccinated. That also comes with operational risks. When your clients start to say to you, we're not going to accept any brokers, or we're not going to accept any nurses, or we're not going to accept any contact with any of your employees are not vaccinated, that is also operational risk. So there really are two sides of the coin around the operational risk. And then number 5 is implementation. The strong legal counsel we've got around this is, while there is a very strong legal foundation for mandatory vaccination, as Hilton, I think, has eloquently described, it all hinges on the implementation. So you need to be meticulous and purposeful around the implementation. So just jumping into some of the reasons why we believe it's so strong, so important for us to implement mandatory vaccination. The first main reason for us as Discovery is an unprecedented public health tragedy in South Africa. So over the last 17 months, since May last year, South Africa has seen over 250,000 excess deaths. To help you calibrate that number, that's about 41% more deaths over the last 17 months in South Africa against the long-term average. And that really is an unprecedented tragedy. Across Discovery, we've lost 22 employees, we've lost 14,000 clients, and I think we've all felt the effects of this pandemic on our organizations, on our clients, on our suppliers, and indeed our communities at large. When you look at this chart here, you'll notice the bottom chart is the excess deaths. Those are deaths above the long-term average. And in each of the waves, the excess deaths really spikes. So in wave 1, we're at 1.5 times as many deaths against the long-term average. Wave 2, 1.9 times as many deaths against the long-term average. And then wave 3, 1.6 times as many deaths against the long-term average. So each one of those lines on the bottom chart is an excess death. The second reason we've moved to mandatory vaccination is compelling evidence, both globally and locally, that vaccines are both safe and effective. As you see from this chart, starting out on the left-hand side of the chart, you notice that the deaths per million as a result of COVID is 1,813. So that's the mortality rate we've seen in South Africa as a result of COVID, 1,800 deaths per million population. That's about 8 to 10 times higher than the mortality rate as a result of flu. But what is fascinating about the numbers on the left-hand side is, if you're vaccinated against COVID, your risk of dying as a result of COVID is about 28% less than dying as a result of the common flu. That's how it really begins to swing the equation. I think a very powerful evidence that these vaccines are very, very effective. On the right-hand side of the page, you'll see data directly out of Discovery. So we've done 2 rounds of analysis alongside Prof. Glenn de Grey and the Sisonke team and the Medical Research Council on Discovery data, over 750,000 data points in this analysis by actuaries and the researchers on Glenn de Grey's team. You notice there that 50 to 80% reduction in infection levels, 50 to 60% across J&J and 70 to 80% across Pfizer 28 days post second dose vaccination. 65 to 90% reduction in admission risk, and then to the far right-hand side of the picture, over 90% reduction in mortality risk. So breakthrough infections do happen. They are relatively rare, but at least when they happen, they reduce the vaccinations reduce the severity of disease and indeed death. The third reason we felt a compelling need to move towards mandatory vaccination is our actuaries are modeling and projecting a fourth wave that will hit South Africa or start to hit South Africa in early December. It'll then peak towards the end of January, middle of February. And I think it's common cause across many actuarial projections that South Africa will see a fourth wave. The only question around the fourth wave is the potential magnitude of the fourth wave. And the magnitude of the fourth wave is determined by A, do we see another variant or not? B, our social behaviors over the coming months. And then C, the most important variable is vaccination. And by our calculations, if we're able to get 60% of South Africa's adult population vaccinated by December, we're able to save ostensibly 25,000 lives. 25,000 lives potentially saved through extensive vaccination efforts. And I think when you calibrate that number, 25,000 lives is 8 times as many people that died in 9/11. So it's a significant quantity. And then the fourth reason for implementing mandatory vaccination, as Kaz alluded to in the earlier parts of the presentation, is we are seeing declining rates of daily vaccination. So what you'll see on this chart here is a 7-day moving average daily vaccination rate. The green line is the national rate and the blue line is discovery rates. Here, slightly different scales. If you just focus on the green line there, you'll notice that we peaked at the end of August at 214,000 daily vaccinations. As of last week, we were down to 116,000 daily vaccinations on a 7-day moving average basis. It's important we measure this on a seven-day basis. That's a 44% decline. If we were to continue at the current levels of 116,000 vaccinations a day, and you project that out to the middle of December, we would reach about 49% of the adult population would be vaccinated by December. That's well short of our 60% target to save 25,000 lives, and even further short of our 70,000 target set by the president. And that's, of course, if we assume we continue at your current levels of vaccination. So I think a pressing need to move towards ramping up these numbers. Wanted to just distill some of our insights around the legal frameworks for vaccination. As Hilton mentioned, there are many acts at play in implementing these frameworks. I'm not going to go into any of that legal detail. What we distilled through our explorations of labor law, constitutional law, and indeed the occupational health and safety laws, these 5 main insights. I think the first one is that we saw the legal opinions of that all employees have rights, not only vaccinated employees. And interestingly enough, in our implementation of the policy, we've had an outpouring from employees who've been vaccinated, with masses of relief that the workplace will be safe here going forward. So when you're thinking about implementing these policies, think about both your vaccinated staff as well as your unvaccinated staff. I think the second one is a little bit counterintuitive and not necessarily something we always think of, is that employers and businesses also have rights here. So we have a right to protect our operations and protect our workplaces as well. Thirdly, as Hilton mentioned, is rights are not absolute, so rights can be limited if in the broader public interest. And I think that is a really important framework in the context of the Constitution. And then, of course, the employers have a legal and moral obligation to provide a safe workplace in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And that really is the sharp end of the wedge, if you will. In fact, in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's a section that deals with hazardous biological agents, which is transmissible viruses and bacteria. And SARS-CoV-2 is very obviously a highly transmissible virus and would certainly be classified as a hazardous biological agent. And then number 5 is in your implementation of the policy, what we've got to make sure we do at every turn in the implementation is prevent any potential instance of unfair discrimination. And in preventing unfair discrimination, there tends to be really two main levers. The one is having a formal objections and exceptions process. And then the second one is the extensive efforts around reasonable accommodations, as Hilton alluded to earlier on. Insofar implementation of the policy, this is a high-level framework for how we're implementing the policy at Discovery. There are two components. On the left-hand side are the principles we're exercising, and on the middle right-hand side is the process we're implementing. So the principles are equally important to the process. You'll notice our principles are one of mutual respect, balancing the rights of all employees, reasonable accommodations, and very proactive engagement to really see this as a contact sport over the coming months. The process is one of informing employees, consulting with employees, and looking for options around their reasonable accommodations. Informing is lots of communication with our employees, lots of exploration around the constitutional and medical reason rights if there are objections that pop up. We've committed to a very consultative process for those employees who object to be vaccinated. We're making both medical and counseling support available in that consultation process. And then we'll obviously look at reasonable accommodations for those employees that have justifiable reasons not to be vaccinated. And that really culminates in outcomes where hopefully as many employees as possible get vaccinated. Some employees would be reasonably accommodated, and then I think in the minority we would in certain instances potentially part ways with certain employees. And then finally, just to wrap it up, we get a lot of questions around the potential liability as a result of adverse events. I wanted to help you calibrate the risk of adverse events in vaccination. So as you see on the left-hand side of the page, the risk of a severe vaccine adverse event is somewhere between 1 and 2 per million vaccinations, somewhere between 1 and 2 per million vaccinations. That's roughly the same risk as being struck by lightning. I mean, that's how small these severe vaccine adverse events risks are. In fact, when you look at the other bars, your risk of dying in a car accident in South Africa is 200 times higher, 233 per million. Your risk of dying as a result of murder in South Africa, unfortunately, is close to 400 per million, almost 400 times higher. And indeed, your risk of dying as a result of COVID in South Africa, certainly over the last 17, 18 months, is 1,810. So almost 1,000 to 2,000 times higher risk of dying from COVID than as a result of a vaccine adverse event. On the right-hand side of the page, you'll see several mechanisms in place in the unlikely event of a severe adverse reaction. So adverse reactions are fully covered by prescribed minimum benefits in medical schemes. So medical schemes will pick up the healthcare costs in relation to vaccination adverse events, no matter how mild, moderate or severe. There's obviously the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act that would deal with instances of adverse reactions. And then the No Faults Compensation Fund that's in place across South Africa works very much the same as the Road Accident Fund, will compensate individuals who've had a severe adverse event, either healthcare related costs or income related costs. So with that, I hope it gives you a good overview and framework. The one thing I did want to mention that I didn't mention in the presentation is, in addition to vaccines reducing infection levels and reducing mortality risk and morbidity risk, there is data emerging now globally that the vaccines reduce transmission risk as well. And the latest CDC studies are showing that there is increasing evidence. It has gone a bit up and down. There was lots of questions around transmission risk as a result of the Delta variant, but the balance of research here seems to be pointing that vaccines definitely reduce transmission risk as well. I'm going to wrap it up there then, Tim.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ron. Carl, could I ask you to come off mute and you can talk us through your experience at Sanlam?
Great, thanks, Timothy. I'm going to save the group here from more PowerPoint presentations. I think the Ronald and Helton have really done the heavy lifting in terms of the rationale and the legalities of proceeding this route of mandatory vaccinations, and we echo the sentiments really that come from those two presentations, and I'll really just get into the approach that we've taken specifically at Sanlam, and it's very much aligned, I think, to what Ronald has just shared with us on their approach. I think the important thing just to highlight at the beginning as well is that this is motivated by humane consideration to this pandemic, which has led to the business having to take certain key decisions that we believe are absolutely necessary along the way. There's been a number of interventions that, as a group, from the beginning, we've looked at, and this is a dynamic space, and these interventions, I think, as we learn more about the pandemic and the challenges that it's presenting with us, we'll probably see new and increasing number of these interventions. Right at the beginning, for example, I think the Sanlam Group, together with the Motsepe Foundation, pledged in the order of R1 billion towards a solidarity fund to assist with the pandemic, and also over the last 18 months, over 30 million rand spent on PPE support to our various stakeholders as part of just addressing the challenges that the virus has presented us with. And with the launch of the vaccination drive earlier this year, we then felt it necessary to pivot towards a package of interventions that would necessarily give a leg up to the vaccination drive in the country. I'll just go into a little bit of detail on that as well. So the Sanlam Group does seriously consider vaccination an important and necessary tool in the fight against the pandemic and in the provision of a reasonably safe workplace to its employees. It also recognizes that most roles in the business will require employees at one time or another to interact with fellow employees or third parties, including clients and potential clients and a variety of other stakeholders as well. This is more likely once employees return to the office as the country gradually reopens. Ahead of this policy implementation, we will continue as a group to provide relevant information about the pandemic and the vaccines, including safety data, positive impact of vaccines on lives, and the like. Sanlam also assists employees by giving them paid time off to get vaccinated at convenient sites. Employees as well will have opportunity to interact with the information and ask whatever questions that they may have that will improve their understanding and acceptance of the vaccines. What we found is that there's a lot of myths out there and a lot of unanswered questions that people have, and these change and vary as we go along. And I think it's very important that in the spirit of that humane consideration, that we're very much alive to those concerns that people have and in addressing those concerns. And also, as a group, we do disapprove of the generation, publication, circulation of false or misleading information about vaccines, especially through our own electronic communication and digital systems, and therefore we deal with decisively in the group, because there can be a tendency for such behavior. To facilitate, I think, the decision-making about workplace arrangements, including on readiness to return to the office, employees will be expected to share their vaccination status, which is proof of status. And we've been very firm and forthright about that particular issue. Just on the issue of, choosing not to vaccinate, we do recognize that some employees may have valid grounds, in inverted commas, for choosing not to take the vaccines, including medical grounds, and each case will be treated based on its own merits. Those employees who have their reasons for not vaccinating, and we will sit down and we will engage and we will test the veracity of those reasons that are put forward. But then there will be certain conditions that we, of necessity, need to put in place to make sure that, as Hilton and Ronald indicated earlier, that this is not an absolute right, and we continue to make sure that it's a safe place for other people as well. And they will be required to subject themselves to a PCR test on a regular basis, and possibly at their own cost as well. And so these are just some of the conditions that are under consideration, which we believe will be necessary. Just from an engagement and awareness point of view, we've implemented a number of different actions to encourage vaccination and to break the barriers and to demystify the myths about the vaccination. We launched a myth-busting campaign a few months ago, myths versus facts, and really to answer a lot of people's unanswered questions. If you get the jab, are they injecting demons into your body? Are they injecting 666, whatever the case might be, into your body? Will they be able to track you? All those sort of issues and questions that I think are natural questions that people have, and we just felt that sort of education drive is very important as part of the journey. In addition to the above, we also made 2 Sanlam sites and 4 Afrocentric sites available as vaccination centers, Afrocentric being our healthcare sector partner throughout the country, just to help alleviate the transportation gap as well for the bulk of our employees, because we have found that the issue of access is also key, and seeing also some of the pop-up and mobile vaccination sites around the country has been encouraging, because we shouldn't forget the fact that a lot of people really struggle with access. With regards to our colleagues on the organized labor employee organization side, we've engaged here with our health and safety committees on the policy position that we're taking, and we continue to engage. And the various cluster businesses in the group that have, for example, unionized staff have consulted with the recognized trade unions in those clusters to make sure that there's proper consultation and engagement on this issue. I'm not going to go to too much detail on the legalities and risks because I think Hilton did go into detail on that, but just some lessons and insights to share with everyone in closing. I've mentioned that we felt it important for us that we explain ourselves and we take time to provide clarity to our employees and other stakeholders as well on the rationale for mandating vaccines. Transparency and communication are very key. We've established that as a key principle, especially highlighting some of the science-based facts about vaccines. We encourage our leaders throughout the group to lead by example, because we truly believe that our employees trust their leaders when they see them doing what they preach as well. And treating everyone with fairness is very key. Understanding that if people are skeptical, and if people have what they believe are valid reasons for not wanting to go this route, that we give them opportunity to put those forward, and we engage them on those specific issues. We don't believe it's going to be an easy journey, but we believe it's an absolutely necessary one, and certainly we're gunning for implementation and kickoff of the policy from January of 2022. This gives us sufficient time as well for the necessary engagements to get us to that point. I'm going to stop there, Timothy, and I think if there are any other issues, those could probably be surfaced in the Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul. And we will have an opportunity to take questions later on. Let me now hand over to Pete, who can talk us through the decision-making as an actual healthcare provider at Life Healthcare. Thank you, Pete. Over to you.
Good afternoon, Timothy. Good afternoon, all, and thank you very much for the opportunity to engage on the topic. My thanks to Halton on the legal background and Ron on the detailed scientific evidence and process. And Carl, I must echo your sentiments on the fact that this is indeed a deeply humane consideration. From a life healthcare perspective, perhaps I can just talk about why we implemented the decision. We took a decision as a management team that the pandemic has been relentless in its destruction in our way of life. And as a company, we were obliged to adopt a definitive approach to safeguard not only our people, but also our country. At an operating level, we decided that the principle that we must abide by in a decision of this magnitude is that whilst we respect individuals' rights to choose, these must give way to the collective safety and well-being of the majority of our workforce, especially in the face of such a pandemic. So it's within this line of thinking that we truly believe that everyone has the right to choose, but that liberty does not free the individual from the consequences of that choice. Clearly, as a healthcare company, we had the opportunity to deliberate over an extended period of time on reliable and emerging scientific evidence. And we based our decision on a risk assessment as to how to make our workplace safe. And we based the decision on facts upon which we could rely, not supposition, hard evidence. And we took the decision within the framework issued by the government. The scientific evidence is clear. I won't repeat all of what Ron took us through earlier, but we as an executive concluded on the basis that people who are vaccinated are 3 times less likely to infect others. People who are vaccinated are 10 times less likely to die. To put that in a practical context, we're starting to see statistics, verifiable statistics emerge that of patients that are in hospital, occupying general wards, high care, and ICU beds, 94% of those patients with COVID are unvaccinated. To take that to a personal level for all of us, if a hospital's capacity in high care and ICU has been absorbed by COVID patients, and one of us unfortunately has a heart attack, a stroke, a car crash, and we arrive seeking care in the hospital, we run the real risk that the capacity in the hospital has already been absorbed by COVID patients. So whilst there's a risk framework from a head office perspective and how we keep the workplace safe, there's a social context within which this decision also rests around not overburdening our healthcare systems, of which we are a primary provider. So using the scientific evidence and the social context of the conversation, we took the decision to impose mandatory vaccination from the 1st of December in our head office. You'll rightfully ask the question, why the head office and why not all the hospital settings at the same time? You will appreciate that the 2 different settings have different traffic flows through them. In our head office environment, all the individuals, all our staff are employees. They are all paid by Life Healthcare, and they all sign up to a contract of employment with Life Healthcare. And the traffic can be both predicted and regulated. So in terms of making it safe, we took the decision that in the head office context, because it's a contained workforce, we were able to not only implement the decision, we were also able to manage that. In our international operations and our hospital settings, traffic is unpredictable. Not all service providers, clinicians, and healthcare workers in the hospital setting are employees of Life Healthcare. And in so doing, a different dynamic emerges, which creates a more complex implementation framework and a more difficult consultation process. So from a practical perspective, we decided to split the settings, and we were also in a position to accelerate the timeframe for implementation in the head office environment to 1 December of this year. It's our intention to conclude the process along the lines that Ron has outlined, with a process of consultation, proactive engagement, and reasonable accommodation. We also, as a healthcare provider, are already enjoying a fairly high level of vaccination, with more than 80% 85% of our workforce already vaccinated. But to get to closure on the topic, we do need to get to completely vaccinated environments in the head office for us to be able to say that we've returned a safe workplace environment to our colleagues. We believe that coming to work should never be a threat to one's life or to one's health. And we've taken the decision with the safety of our colleagues in mind, understanding that the implementation of this decision is not only right for Life Healthcare's head office, ultimately for its hospital settings, it's also right for our staff, it's right for our country, it's the right thing to do. Thank you, Timothy.
So, thanks so much, Pete. Martin, could I ask that you take over now just to give the summation of B4SA's views, and thereafter could I ask all the participants please to turn your cameras back on, and we will then try and field as many of the questions that we have in the Q&A as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you everybody for attending. I think that the experience that we've heard from Ron and Carl and Peter, and the setting that was given to us by Cass, and critically importantly, the legal framework that Halton has explained, are all fundamental tools to enable each and every one of us to assess where we sit in the spectrum of determining whether or not, and if so, how we can impose vaccine mandates. What I think is clear as B4SA is that we need to mitigate the risks as responsibly and as comprehensively, but also as quickly as possible. And those risks are very real, as we've heard. The reality is that the vaccination rollout program has not been as quick or as comprehensive as we would have liked it to be. We're sitting at a much lower level of the adult population than we need to be, particularly in anticipation of the fourth wave. And as Ron indicated, it's not a question of whether, but when and how significant the fourth wave is going to be, and how many of our adult population we can in fact vaccinate ahead of the fourth wave. And that means that we need to radically step up the rate of vaccination, recognizing the statistics that we've heard, including from the minister this morning. We've also heard the government initially expressing, I would say, some negativity about the concept of vaccination mandates. In our engagements with them, they've been clear they're now going to be neutral, but they're going to follow the lead by the rest of society, particularly, but not only by the private sector. And when I say particularly and not only by the private sector, I don't know how many of you have noticed that WITS actually put out a mandatory vaccination framework earlier on, which has asked for comments by the 11th of October, where they've made it clear that all staff, all students, visitors, and service providers will be required to be vaccinated before accessing the campus. We've seen the same situation, of course, arising at UCT. And if we look around the world, we know that that is, of course, the trend that is starting to emerge, and a critical trend. The data and the science is absolutely unequivocal, as we've seen from the documentation and the presentation that Ron has put up and that is in the public domain, not just with respect to those that have directly died from COVID, but excess deaths as well, and the benefits that accrue both to individuals as well as to those that they're in contact with in the context of being vaccinated, and lowering the pressure on the healthcare facilities broadly, and enabling the economy, and we need to emphasize that, to return to normal as quickly as possible. Because unless and until such time as the vast majority of the adult population are vaccinated, we're going to continue not just to see fourth and subsequent waves, but actually restrictions way beyond just adjusted level 1 and adjusted level 2. And we all appreciate the ramifications that has for our individual lives and livelihoods, for our businesses, and for the economy at large. By the same token, we need to be mindful of the rights and responsibilities of employees and employers, not just to one another, but as well as to society more broadly. And I think that's become increasingly apparent. Although we've only invited 3 companies to present that have already announced the fact that they've introduced vaccination mandates, there are a number of CEOs on this call who we know are already considering from various sectors the ramifications of imposing mandates in a responsible and appropriate manner, but also many who've already actually put in place those vaccination mandates. We know without a shadow of a doubt that the vaccine is the most effective tool that's available to us currently in the context of the virus. It goes hand in glove, the mandating process, with the vaccination certificates that are going to play a significant role there as well. And we've been, alongside many on the call, at the forefront of engaging with government over the past 2 months, resulting in the release of the digital vaccination certificate today. And we're going to see that grow, not just again in South Africa, but much more broadly to enable us to open up our economy and across the world. What is clear is that we've got adequate access to the vaccines. We've got sites that can be pivoted and utilized for those employers that don't have immediate access to the ability to administer the vaccine themselves across the country, both in the public and the private sector. We need to now generate very significant and sustainable demand to protect us as quickly as possible, not just in the short and immediate term, but as Ron indicated, for the longer term. What I would suggest now is that I hand back to you, Timothy, so that we can take comments and questions for the balance of the time that we have available. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. Could I ask that everyone put your, well, not everyone, sorry, only the speakers. We have very nearly 500 people still on the call. Which also means we have a huge number of questions that are streaming in. Just to knock a few of those on the head, the recording of this will be available. It takes a little while for us to get that along with the presentations, and we will load these up on the B4SA website, and those will also be distributed in the newsletter that goes out on a Tuesday. So if you want to see any of that detail and you need the PowerPoint presentations, all of that will be available. So if you've missed some of it, don't despair. Then let me swing over to a few questions. And Ron, I'm going to start with you because there are a few that have been directed to you. And then could I also ask that Pete and Carl and Helton and Martin and Cass, if you want to add to any of the questions, of the answers, either given by Ron or by the rest of us on the panel, please do chip in. So Ron, starting with you, it's just a question about objections. So have you seen any objections that you've had to reasonably accommodate? And what are some of those examples from staff, of course?
Yeah. So we are formally kicking off our objections and exceptions process on the 20th of October. So we haven't actually started the formal objections process yet. What we have received are a few preliminary objections. So we've received a handful of preliminary objections. They've been a mix of medical reasons and religious reasons primarily. What has been interesting around those objections, though, is that on consultation with those employees, and remember I said our approach is a proactive consultative approach, the vast majority of employees have already retracted their objections and don't intend to lodge a formal objection. So the vast majority of them have elected to be vaccinated. And the reason we found that was we found quite a big portion of our population was seeking additional information and confirmation. There's obviously a lot of confusion out there around their vaccination. And as soon as you're able to counsel employees one-on-one, in fact, I did one session yesterday with one employee, and yeah, she got vaccinated this morning. Yeah, people tend to move towards their vaccination.
Thank you, Ron. As the resident doctor on the call, I'm going to try and just bundle up a few of the more medically orientated as opposed to legally orientated questions. So the first relates to risk. So if the majority of COVID deaths for those over 60, and that isn't all with serious underlying health concerns, and that isn't the profile of a majority of people in work. So the question is, then effectively, how does mandatory vaccination reduce the risk to the staff who don't fall into that category?
Yeah, so I think it's true to say that COVID disproportionately affects people over the age of 60 more than other parts of the population. It also, I think, importantly, it affects people with chronic disease. So people with diabetes, hypertension, and so on and so forth. And we see many people across our population below the age of 60 with diabetes, hypertension, and various cardiovascular diseases. And if you've got one of those diseases, effectively your risk is equivalent to a person over the age of 60. So that's, I think, the first important point to make. The second important point to make on that is when you look at the excess deaths data, while 70% of excess deaths are people over the age of 60, it implies that 30% of excess deaths are people under the age of 60. And I can tell you across the 22 employees we've lost at Discovery, we lost 2 individuals 3 weeks ago below the age of 30 due to COVID. I think I can also point out to you across the Discovery data, very interesting stats. So 60% of Discovery's COVID-19 hospital admissions are between the ages of 18 and 50. 60% of our hospital admissions are people between the ages of 18 and 50. So I think to say COVID definitely affects people below the age of 60. It definitely causes death in people below the age of 60. We see this in the excess deaths data. We see this in the Discovery data. And certainly if you've got a chronic condition, you're predisposed to your higher risk as a result of COVID. And I guarantee you across your populations, you will have high prevalence of diabetes and hypertension, no matter what the age of your staff are.
Thanks, Ron. A last couple of questions just on this theme before we move back to the legalities and policy issues. The question is posed, what about people who've had COVID? So you've developed some degree of immunity. Is there not a sort of natural immunity? And what are the alternatives to vaccination? So those who are not keen on vaccination, what else can they do? Or is there no alternative?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And thank you for asking that. I think the first point there is that there is some level of natural immunity if you've had COVID before. So that you certainly build up antibody levels post-COVID-19 infection. A few important points on that. One is your immunity is largely dependent on the variant you were infected by. So Delta immunity is different to Beta immunity, is different to the original Wuhan variant immunity. So if you were, for instance, infected in the first wave, that immunity wouldn't transfer through the current waves. And in fact, while Beta immunity seems to give you a good Delta immunity, you don't know what that immunity will mean for future variants. I think the second thing is that natural immunity is variable. So there are people who have high levels of immunity that persist over time. There are people who have immunity that wane quickly over time. There's people who have immunity that decrease over time. So natural immunity is a very variable construct, whereas vaccine-related immunity gives you a very consistent high level of immunity that tends to at least persist over the 6 to 8 months, and then is obviously topped up likely through booster doses. I think the final point to raise on the immunity question, and it is important in the context of South Africa's population because we have had very high levels of infection across South Africa, is that vaccinating on the top of natural immunity provides multiples of immunity. So we refer to it as hybrid immunity. Adrian refers to it as super immunity. So if you're vaccinating on top of natural immunity, you actually get significantly more protection and significantly more reduction in morbidity and mortality risk.
Thanks, Ron. Helton, could I address a question to you, and it relates to new hires. So if an employer has a mandatory vaccination policy, can this be included in an advert for a position or requested during an interview without being seen as discrimination?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's again, if it's not unfair discrimination to require an employee to be vaccinated, the same would be to require new entrants to be vaccinated. And it's no different, I think, from any other medical requirements that you may have of an employee. That in some employments circumstances, the employee has to go through a medical test, and in order to meet the qualifications of the job. So I think it wouldn't be discriminatory. Of course, it will definitely draw, certainly at the beginning or initially, a great deal of publicity, but in itself, it wouldn't constitute unfair discrimination.
And a related question, what about exemptions? So premised on religious grounds, for instance.
What do you mean by exemptions on religious grounds?
So
from providing in your policy to not include, to make it mandatory for everyone other than those who belong to a particular religious sect.
So as I read the question, and I'll ask also Carl and Pete to come in on this, if you have made vaccination mandatory in your company, and then you receive objections from staff asking for an exemption from the policy on the basis of their religious objections, how would that be dealt with in the law? And then Carl and Pete, if I could ask you to expand on that and how you plan to deal with that, or have already dealt with that practically within your own companies.
Okay, so in my presentation, which was very brief, but given the time constraints, it's my view that it isn't a breach of the right to religion, and it's based on the principle that what the right in the Constitution protects is the free exercise of religion. It doesn't protect the tenets themselves. So accordingly, just as a matter of law, I think it's not an infringement of the right to religion, and that's a legal constitutional interpretation. There's no doubt that others might disagree with me, but there's a great deal of US authority on the subject, and it's quite important to realize that our constitutional court relies on comparative constitutional jurisprudence in coming to its decisions, and the US Supreme Court in this particular instance, I think, would be very compelling.
Yeah, I think, Timothy, just to answer Greg's question on that, I echo what Helton is saying, and possibly in South Africa, not yet tested ground this. Helton did indicate in his presentation as well that people's basic human rights are not absolute. And I think we have to take that into consideration. And which is why we've said that we will engage with people and really test the merits of the issues that they put on the table, and then of necessity, we will still need to make sure that we provide a safe and healthy working environment for other employees. So if we have to impose certain conditions then around weekly testing or daily testing, whatever the case might be, I mean, that then would be the I suppose the cost that would come with that exemption if we did get to that point. But I think these issues we will be tested as we go along and as we deal with the individual cases on their merits.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, I think, from a life healthcare perspective, the number one organizational construct is to design a process, not to design the process around the exceptions. to design the process and then have the engagement model that allows you to identify exceptions. And in the context of reasonable accommodation, adjudicate each exception as it's presented on its merits. In the continuity of the company and the preservation of workplace safety will prevail over the individual selection made. And in that context, we need to be true to what we are ultimately trying to achieve. We've also got to have a sustainable organization. And people opting out of never coming back to the office puts them in a position where we have to be able to adjudicate whether or not their job of work can be done. In the context of running our head office, it's not possible for us to physically bifurcate the workplace between vaccinated and unvaccinated and still have a sustainable organization. So it brings with it its own level of practical complexities. But in the reasonableness of a conversation, exemptions or requests thereto will be adjudicated, and our ability to implement it will then have to be done, bearing in mind we need workplace safety as the priority.
Thanks, Pete. Martin, a question about proof. How does one go about determining who is vaccinated or not? And perhaps, Hilton, if you could also come in, can an employer insist on seeing a certificate?
Well, I think that we should get Hilton to answer the question first, because I actually think it's a legal question. We do know that the requirement for vaccination certificates is going to become almost universal, and not just to enter the workplace, by the way, but also to enter many other locations. Indeed, Hilton talked about the possibility of going into retail stores and so on and so forth. And I point to, as I said, the announcement that's just been put out by Wits, but I think we should be led by Hilton on this.
Yes, I think it's entirely lawful. Again, if the policy requires that the employee demonstrate that they've been vaccinated, then they must provide the proof that is required. It's no different from requiring an employee who you want to employ as a driver or is employed to produce his license. It's, you know, and to the extent that the Employment Equity Act has a provision regarding you know what an employer can require, it doesn't fall under that prohibition. So yes, an employer can require proof of vaccination, and so the vaccination passport is going to be precisely that.
So
it's the same way, and it's quite important to realize that what I haven't dealt with, of course, is that every employer is also has a property right, whether you own the building or the premises, or whether you lease the premises. Ultimately, you have a property right, and the property right is to say that people can come onto your property on specific conditions. If I go into a government office, I have to take my computer out. They take out the details of my computer, and so they won't let you in without proof either of you know, of one kind or another. They test my temperature when I go into any one of these places. So again, it's these things are entirely the source of the power flows from being an employer and from being having property rights, determining who comes in and who doesn't.
Just a related question, and you might have answered it, but let me pose it in the way it has been put on the chat. What would the impact of the new legislation, so POPIA in legislation, be in ascertaining the vaccination status of employees? So does this count under POPIA legislation as being individual or protected information from employees? And how would employers deal with this as a hurdle?
Well, it's certainly the disclosure by the employer of information that it requires of its employees is covered by POPIA, but it doesn't appear, and it doesn't affect the employer's right to require certain information to be produced.
Thanks, Helton. Ron, if I could return to you, a couple of discovery questions, but also medical questions. So the first is, are you administering antigens? So this is specifically discovery as an alternative. And while you're contemplating that, could you talk about what are the considerations for booster vaccinations, and will vaccinations provide lifetime protection?
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure what the antigen question is actually posing. Yeah, I think it's probably related to antigen testing. Remember, there are two types of COVID tests. There's the PCR test and there's the antigen test. The PCR test is the gold standard for detecting COVID, and the antigen test is certainly a very, very effective test, particularly for people who are contagious with COVID, so at the peak of their infection. We likely will consider both of those tests. We've looked at the data on the antigen testing and are very comfortable that antigen tests are a reliable testing methodology. In fact, you would have seen in The Economist this morning, it looks like the UK is going to implement antigen testing over PCR testing as the entry criteria into the UK. So I hope that's what the question was related to. I can't think of any other antigen related response. I think the question around boosters is an important question. I think what we are seeing globally out of the US, Israel, and various other countries is we are seeing levels of waning immunity across the Pfizer vaccine in particular, but also predictably across some of the other vaccines. And that immunity seems to wane somewhere between 6 and 8 months post initial vaccination. So I think from a South Africa perspective, I think there is a strong case to be made for booster doses, likely starting out in the healthcare workers, firstly, because healthcare workers started vaccination early in the year, February and March. But then extending it to high-risk populations, so elderly populations, immunocompromised populations. And the data we're seeing on booster doses is very powerful. The booster doses are really proving effective across the countries that have implemented booster doses, against the backdrop of sufficient quantities of vaccine in South Africa. We've got well in excess of 16 million doses available in South Africa. I think we would strongly advocate for booster doses, certainly in healthcare workers, certainly in high-risk populations, and in the elderly. And this is not uncommon. We see booster doses in many other vaccines as well.
Thanks very much, Ron. I appreciate everyone that we've gone slightly over time. I will ask your indulgence just to answer one or two further questions and remind you that the full session will be available on the B4SA website. Since they are primarily legal, I'm going to return to you, Helton, and just ask you a couple of questions. Can a fully vaccinated employee refuse to go into a workplace where the employer is not enforcing mandatory vaccinations? So can I, if I'm vaccinated and my company requires me to go to a client that doesn't enforce vaccination, am I within my rights to refuse to go to that site?
That's a very interesting question. In both Occupational Health and Safety Acts, provision is made for employees to refuse to enter a workplace that is dangerous to their safety and their health. Now, those are normally in urgent situations. So there does exist a right not to go into an unsafe workplace, but the proper response for the employee would be to report this to the inspectorate, and then the inspectorate would arrive at the employee's premises, and given Section 8(1) and the obligation of the employer to make reasonable take reasonable measures to ensure a healthy and safe workplace, that would seem to me to be the manner in which it would be done.
Thanks, Helton. Just some related questions just before we wrap up. Firstly, there's this, I think you might have answered this, but just for clarity's sake, does the employer have the right to dismiss an employee on the basis of them not being able to fulfill their job function? That's if they have refused to be vaccinated and therefore when there's mandatory vaccination and therefore unable to come in and provide the service they would normally provide.
Yes, I think, and I think in my presentation that I deal with it. And that's really based on the incapacity argument. It's the argument that you require a driver's license to be a driver. And if you lose your driver's license or you don't produce your driver's license, then you become incapable of performing your job, and as a result, termination is dismissal is permissible under the Labour Relations Act.
Thanks, Helton. One final question for you. What about customers? Can you require customers to present proof of vaccination before servicing them or allowing them into a building?
Yes, and that's a property right. So, for example, you'll see that in most shops, almost all shops that and restaurants, they say no mask, no entry. And the same would be no vaccination passport, no entry. And that would flow from a property right, because there's no other legal relationship between the owner or the lessee of the premises and the customer. So yes, it's the same thing. I go to the gym and they take my temperature, and if my temperature is above normal, they won't let me in.
Yeah, just to add to that, Timothy, I mean, I worked at Transnet for many years, and specifically in the port terminals environment, and no one was allowed inside the terminal without a hard hat, yellow jacket, and safety boots. And on top of that, you had to take a breathalyzer test. So even if it was a customer coming into the terminal, if you blew red, as we called it, you were denied access into the terminal. And if you're an employee, it could lead to a disciplinary process for coming to work, obviously above the limit. I know, I mean, that's a little bit different from injecting a vaccine into your body, but I think putting in place those sort of restrictions is something that employers are well within their rights to do.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I'm afraid we're now pushing 10 minutes past the half hour. I'm going to ask just each of the remaining panelists. Pete did have to drop off for another meeting. If you would like to give any final thoughts before we close, speak now or forever hold your peace as far as this presentation is concerned. Cass, Martin, any final thoughts from you? No, thumbs up from Cass. Ron and Carl, any final thoughts?
Happy, Timothy, I think my only hope here is that business acts in unison in this manner. I've looked at the comments that came through in the chat, and there seems to be overwhelming support for going this mandatory route. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. With that, everybody, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We've discussed a huge amount of information. As I said beforehand, this will be recorded. It will be on the B4SA website, and you will be able to see the presentations that have been delivered today. With that, let me thank you and wish you a safe and pleasant weekend.